Introduction to Philosophy, Lecture 26, The Ethics of Belief and the Will to Believe. Like so many other concepts we've examined in this course, we've gone back and forth on different ideas of knowledge. In the ancient works of Plato, Socrates talked his companions into confusion, leading them to question things they had previously believed were simple and straightforward. One of the guiding questions of the Theaetetus was, "What is knowledge?" And they never really came to a clear conclusion. However, the best that they could come up with while being led on by Socrates was that knowledge is true belief with an account, or what would eventually be referred to as justified true belief. However, thousands of years later, Gettier showed us that Plato was right to be skeptical of his own proposed definition and demonstrated that instances of justified true belief can exist that do not constitute knowledge. So, what are we even talking about when we do epistemology? Well, one unfortunate answer is that we are philosophizing about justified true belief until we figure out what the missing fourth ingredient is in knowledge that justified true belief is missing. So, let's just tentatively say that when we philosophize about knowledge, justified true belief is what we're usually talking about. So, if we were talking about beliefs, we can rephrase some of our basic epistemological questions and concerns as, what is belief? How do we acquire belief? And as our epistemology begins to merge with ethics, as we saw in the last lecture, we start including questions like, what are unethical beliefs? Are there unethical beliefs? What can I believe? And what should I believe or disbelieve? These are all questions that lead to what is called epistemic responsibility and epistemic virtue. Some epistemic virtues could include testimonial justice, like we saw last time, and intellectual modesty, indeed, recognizing that we can be wrong and understanding that we don't know everything is typically considered a prerequisite for wisdom. Without intellectual modesty, any type of education will be hindered. Without a sense of epistemic responsibility, we may, as some do, just think things up and then go spreading those ideas as though they're facts, when they may be completely wrong. Or we may end up believing things just because they sound good to us, lacking any kind of analytical procedure for forming reasonable beliefs. This reminds me of a student I sat next to in a philosophy class as an undergraduate. Whenever anyone was participating in a class discussion and someone said something along the lines of, "It seems like it would follow that," or "It seems like that would be wrong," this student would always respond with a smirk and say, "But nothing is what it seems." This went on for over half a semester, until one day, when this student was obviously intensely invested in an argument in class, they said, "It seems like something something." And my immature mind and cruel tongue couldn't help themselves, and retorted, "Yeah, but nothing is what it seems." Everyone in the class whom they'd ever shined on with that line burst into muffled laughter. That student never blew off anyone's argument with that line again. I didn't have to say that. They would have grown out of it eventually. Even though in a small way it may have helped them along, and everyone they ever shot down with that line would say they had it coming, I realize now that it was a young and stupid act of cruelty. These are the kinds of realizations we make when we form beliefs like nothing is what it seems, solely because we like the sound of them. This can lead us to our acceptance of debunked conspiracy theories as true, to spreading potentially harmful misinformation, and causing epistemic harm to others by leading them away from truth. As Aristotle says in the first line of his Metaphysics, all men by nature desire to know. We are all potential knowers, or perhaps at best potential believers, and the beliefs that we all want are true beliefs. William James frames this idea in terms of guiding laws. He says, "There are two ways of looking at our duty in the matter of opinion, ways entirely different, yet ways about whose difference the theory of knowledge seems hitherto to have shown very little concern. We must know the truth, and we must avoid error. These are our first and great commandments, as would-be knowers. But they are not two ways of stating an identical commandment. There are two separable laws. Although it may indeed happen that when we believe the truth A, we escape as an incidental consequence from believing the falsehood B, it hardly ever happens that by merely disbelieving B, we necessarily believe A. We may, in escaping B, fall into believing another falsehood, C or D, just as bad as B, or we may escape B by not believing anything at all, not even A. So, it could be argued that spreading mere hunches as though they are facts, or spreading misinformation because we don't understand logic or information literacy, could be considered epistemically vicious behaviors, since they multiply the traps of false belief that we're all trying to avoid. To some, this may sound harsh, but others have taken this concept of epistemic responsibility much further. For example, William Kingdon Clifford was an aggressive proponent of epistemic responsibility. To illustrate his view, he offered an anecdote of a ship owner who knew that his ship was old and due for maintenance, but convinced himself, without any evidence, that the ship is still seaworthy. So he allowed the ship to go on a transatlantic voyage. Clifford describes the ship owner as watching the ship depart with a light heart and benevolent wishes for the success of the exiles in their strange new home that was to be, and got his insurance money when she went down in the middle of the ocean and told no tales. What shall we say of him? Surely this, that he was verily guilty of the death of those men. It is admitted that he did sincerely believe in the soundness of his ship, but the sincerity of his conviction can in no wise help him, because he had no right to believe on such evidence as was before him. He had acquired his belief not by honestly earning it in patient investigation, but by stifling his doubts. And although in the end he may have felt so sure about it that he could not think otherwise, yet inasmuch as he had knowingly and willingly worked himself into that frame of mind, he must be held accountable for it. Clifford's example has persuasive thrust for many, but for people with religious convictions, this moral and epistemic attack on beliefs with insufficient evidence strikes a deep nerve, since, in the failure to prove the reality of free will, we lose our defense against the argument from evil. It is often contested that belief in God is logically inconsistent, on top of the argument that there is absolutely no evidence for the existence of God. To sum up his view, Clifford contends that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Clifford continues, "If a man, holding a belief which he was taught in childhood, or persuaded of afterwards, keeps down and pushes away any doubts which arise about it in his mind, purposely avoids the reading of books and the company of men that call into question or discuss it, and regards as impious those questions which cannot easily be asked without disturbing it, the life of that man is one long sin against mankind." These are indeed strong words, so it's not surprising that they provoked a response from his contemporaries. Enter William James. As this is an introductory course, and we are limited on time, we are forced to focus on intellectual heavyweights, and as said in Lecture 1, William James is no exception. James was another example of an intellectual powerhouse. He was well studied in physiology and philosophy, and was one of the first to establish an experimental psychology lab at Harvard University. Even though a notable amount of work was done in German philosophy departments to separate psychology from philosophy as a standalone science, it was James who first pulled it off, though credit is mixed for a variety of reasons. But historically, he is as well known in psychology as he is in philosophy. The guy even earned an MD, though I don't think he ever practiced medicine professionally. Despite these already impressive credentials, in his published work, he made incredible contributions to philosophy, physiology, and psychology. As a religiously minded person and intellectual, James could clearly see where Clifford was going with his arguments. In a partial response to Clifford, James published a lecture to a class of Protestant students entitled The Will to Believe, though it could have justifiably been entitled The Right to Believe. Now, let's unpack the vital points of James' argument in response to Clifford-style objections to the endorsement of religious beliefs. James provides a formidable justification for religious belief despite insufficient evidence. A religious experience can be transformative, and when it is, it necessarily comes with epistemic difficulties. It can enrich people's lives, relieve existential angst, and facilitate happiness. Of course, true religious conversion radically changes one's deeply held values and may also be the result of cultural upbringing. Though belief induced by religious experience may not constitute a decision in itself, when an important decision must be made and informative evidence is found wanting, James argues that passional decisions are warranted. James writes, "Let us give the name of hypothesis to anything that may be proposed to our belief, and just as the electricians speak of live and dead wires, let us speak of any hypothesis as either live or dead. A live hypothesis is one which appeals as a real possibility to him to whom it is proposed. If the hypothesis is among the mind's possibilities, it is alive. This shows that deadness and liveness are not intrinsic properties, but relations to the individual thinker. They are measured by his willingness to act, and the maximum of liveness in an hypothesis means willingness to act irrevocably. Practically, that means belief, but there is some believing tendency whenever there is willingness to act at all. If a reflective person hypothesizes that some belief or course of action would constitute an experience that conforms to their authentically held values and is accessible to them, then it is alive. Coupled with a well-reflected commitment to an irrevocable action, the irrevocability adds to its liveness. Furthermore, let us call the decision between two hypotheses an option. Options may be of several kinds. They may be 1. Living or dead, 2. Forced or avoidable, 3. Momentous or trivial. And for our purposes, we may call an option a genuine option when it is of the forced, living, and momentous kind. At decision points consisting of living, forced, and momentous options, in other words, genuine options, James argues that our passional nature not only lawfully may, but must decide an option between propositions whenever it is a genuine option that cannot, by its nature, be decided on intellectual grounds. For to say, under such circumstances, do not decide but leave the question open, is itself a passional decision, just like deciding yes or no, and is attended with the same risk of losing the truth. An example of what this could look like would be to consider asking someone out on a date, and you have no evidence that they like you or not. They've never been mean to you, but they've never been more than professionally polite either. The possibility of asking them out happens to be a live option to you, because the belief that they could like you back or agree to the date are within your mind's realm of possibilities. The option is also forced, because you must either ask the person out or not ask them out. Since this person could end up being the love of your life, the option could also be considered momentous. Since you have no evidence to believe this person will agree or disagree, you can't make either decision based on evidence. Your decision will be a passional decision whether you act on the belief that they will say yes or not act on the belief that they will say no. We could add to this scenario with an aspect of irrevocability. Say you do know this person's favorite restaurant, and reservations need to be made weeks in advance, and they are non-refundable. Since you don't want to wait more than a few weeks to ask this person out, you make the reservations based on your passionate belief that they will agree. But again, if you decide not to, that decision and belief would also be passional and not based on sufficient or even any evidence at all. There are numerous examples of decisions and beliefs like these that we could lawfully choose or endorse passionately on insufficient evidence, but the scenario that James has in mind is one of religious belief. Of course, as we noted in our discussion of Pascal's wager, we can't actually choose what we believe. Some claims are just not live hypotheses to us. The hypothesis that God exists isn't a live hypothesis to some, but very alive to others, though they may not have any religious affiliation. If it is a live hypothesis, and that person's experience of the world is such that God must exist, then they may be licensed to believe in God or in some religion. Since belief in God is also forced and momentous, for this person, they don't have to try to suppress their belief in God due to insufficient evidence, because suppressing their belief, if possible, choosing to disbelieve, is the same as believing that God doesn't exist, would itself be a passional decision based on insufficient evidence. Though one could argue that suppressing belief in God is not exactly the same as holding the belief that God does not exist, James seems to argue that they are functionally the same, inasmuch as they both deprive us of the possibility of a truth that we are justified in accepting passionately. Furthermore, suspending belief doesn't directly lead to truth as lawful passional belief can, and suspending belief can just as easily lead to a belief in some other falsehood. So, James seems to have effectively turned the tables on Clifford, since choices and beliefs do exist that constitute genuine options, so they are important and forced on us. In other words, we must make decisions that fit the formula for a genuine option. There is no way around it, and those decisions must be made passionately and often with insufficient evidence. So, Clifford appears guilty of the same irrationality he was arguing against, since his principle, that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence, though understandable, is unrealistic. And as we've said multiple times throughout the course of these lectures, ought implies can. So, if Clifford's view leads to instances where it suggests we ought to do something that we can't, then, at least in those instances, the view is in need of revision. Therefore, in relevant cases of religion, morality, politics, or interpersonal relationships, there are some genuine option beliefs that, based on our passional natures and epistemic limitations, we have a right to believe.